From the Zimmerman Symphony Center in Canton, Ohio, this is Orchestrating Change. I'm Matthew Jenkins Yarashevitz, Associate Conductor of the Canton Symphony Orchestra.
And I'm Rachel Hegemeyer, Manager of Education and Community Engagement.
Welcome to our podcast, and thank you for joining us.
This podcast will navigate the problems that exist in the field of classical music and the world at large. We invite you to listen with open ears as our guests share their experiences as underrepresented professionals in the music industry.
Today's guest is composer and pianist Eric Gould. He is currently a professor of composition and piano at Berklee College of Music in Boston, having previously taught at his alma mater, Cleveland State University. As a pianist, he has performed with numerous legends of the jazz world and has been featured as a guest soloist here at the Canton Symphony Orchestra. A prolific composer for a wide variety of ensembles, his orchestral work, An American City, was commissioned by the Canton Symphony Orchestra in honor of the City of Canton's bicentennial in 2005. Most recently, he composed our theme music, which you hear at the beginning and end of each episode of our podcast. Eric Gould, welcome to Orchestrating Change.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
It's so wonderful to have you today. And we've talked with you about the podcast from the very beginning. You were actually one of the people involved with some of our first conversations about it. So we're finally actually being able to talk to you, which is amazing. So just to start us off today, can you just tell us a little bit about how you were engaged with music growing up and then what led to you pursuing a career in music?
Well, growing up, I grew up in a household that was literally full of all kinds of music. So my appreciation for it was organic because my parents appreciated music and were knowledgeable about it. My parents and all of my siblings played music, although only my brother played professionally. So there was literally always music playing in the house. Mm. And my mother loved classical and Spanish music. My father loved jazz and blues and played violin in his high school orchestra, which was a very high level music school, a very high level music program at his school. My brother was a rock guitarist in the mold of Jimi Hendrix and could play a mean boogie-woogie piano. My older sister played clarinet in junior high and high school, and the younger of my two sisters studied classical piano. So there was always recorded music going on and being practiced around the house. I heard R&B, rock, jazz, classical music, African music, blues, gospel, folk music in our house alone. And then there were my friends and neighbors who shared music with me. We had a Cleveland orchestra member that lived 3 doors down the street, Martin Simon. I lived in a diverse melting pot of a neighborhood that if you walked half a mile in one direction, it was a Hungarian neighborhood. And that's where I took clarinet lessons. And when I walked down Buckeye Road in those days, I could hear, I could pass a place called Mike Boros's Cafe, and there would be musicians in there doing jam sessions playing Eastern European folk music. I could walk a half a mile in the other direction, and all up and down Kinsman were clubs where you could hear the sound of jazz organ trios spilling out into the street, even during the day. So music was literally all around me, and I fell in love with it. So the process of me becoming a composer was pretty organic. I was always trying, even when I was 7 or 8 years old, I was trying to create my music, my own music. So the process of ordering sound and the appreciation for ordering sound was already there. And when I was 11 years old, my father took me, my father had gone to the same high school as Billy Strayhorn and numerous other people. And so he took me to see Duke Ellington when I was 11, and I
Mm.
was mesmerized.
Wow.
A few years later, I was playing in an R&B band, and I was writing songs. And one day, my father was playing Quincy Jones's Gulu Matari
Mm.
on the stereo, and that did it. I stole the record from him until I could buy my own, and I played it over and over again. And I knew every note of that tune. And I found myself on a journey to learn how to orchestrate Black music.
Mm.
And so I was learning on my own. And by the time I was in high school, my brother, who was 10 years older than me, owned a recording studio, was in a band with a lot of good musicians. And that was an experimental improvisational band. And I was around a lot of very creative musicians who were at least 10 years older than me.
Mm.
So I learned to ask a lot of questions and to soak up literally everything around me. I went to libraries a lot. I read books on harmony and music theory. I listened to music literally all the time. I was the guy who would totally drop out of the conversation if there was interesting music playing in the background. So I had other creative interests like creative writing, photography, and film production, and I devoted all of my time to creative pursuits. So, I mean, by the time I had my first formal composition lesson, there was literally no kind of music that sounded strange to me.
Mm.
And my first teacher, a gentleman by the name of Norman Dinnerstein, gave me the three pieces to listen to: Georgi Ligody's Atmospheres, Hale Smith's Ritual and Incantations, and Igor Stravinsky's Le Sacre du Printemps, The Rite of Spring.
Mm-hmm.
And I liked it all, but The Rite of Spring just blew me away.
Mm.
I bought a copy of Loren Mazel conducting the Vienna Philharmonic and listened to it literally well over 100 times. I can remember just that year alone, over 100 times. I can remember my neighbor coming and knocking on my door and saying, "Don't you have any other records?" You know, and the big breakthrough for me was learning about form. So once I began to think in a more structured way, I was able to do more with my own music. So that's sort of it.
Wow.
So a big goal of our podcast is to explore the issue of lack of representation by minorities in classical music, in particular women composers and African Americans, both on stage as well as in the program of actually what music is being programmed. You've been around for a little while, certainly longer than Rachel and myself. Would you say that in your lifetime, things have changed at all for the better in this regard, or have things kind of stayed the same and not much progress at all has been made?
Well, you began by saying that I've been around a while.
I apologize.
So I can admit freely at this point, since I've been outed. I came of age in the late 60s and 70s, and was always a little bit older than my peers because I was the youngest in my family. My brother was 10 years older than myself, and I had a sister 7 years older. So things that they experienced and were going through, I was witnessing and almost living vicariously in some respect. In that period, racism was more in your face. It was a period of really great social unrest. Today is not even approaching that, but it is fearfully it might get there. I can't think of any African Americans who I went to high school with who were on a professional track then to become classical musicians in the Western European tradition. Most of the talented African Americans were pursuing Black music. And even when I went to college, and I encountered musicians who were pursuing training in Western European classical music. Most of them were preparing for careers in Black music. Mm. And so there simply wasn't the option to get a degree in any art form outside of the European tradition, not limited only to music. Mm. And the most you could do was take a few classes in Black music, and it often wasn't even referred to or acknowledged as such in many cases. So I came to view the pursuit of a career in classical music as sort of a fruitless endeavor. I just didn't witness any success nor receive any encouragement until much later. And so today there are entities like the Sphinx organization with a mission to help African Americans and Latino musicians in that tradition. So things are better from that standpoint. Mm-hmm. I can remember in the 1980s, in the late 1980s, being asked to fill in for the executive director of the Cleveland Music Settlement, where I was working at the time, and participate in a series of meetings that were hosted by the Cleveland Orchestra. It was a panel in the late 1980s that was there to address the same questions that we're addressing now. That was 32 years ago. Yeah. There were 2 African Americans in the orchestra at that time. One of them was my father-in-law, and there are 2 now. Although I do applaud and am happy to see the recent hire of Effendi Yusuf, who's an Egyptian, I believe, clarinetist. Yeah. There have been a number of orchestras around the country who've hired their first 1 or 2. So the needle has nudged ever so slightly over the years. It's certainly a more fertile environment than what my late father-in-law had to endure. And meanwhile, though, the infrastructure of public education and school music programs like the one that my father attended, and schools, great music schools around the country like Cass Tech in Detroit and Westinghouse, they are becoming more and more of a rarity. So the infrastructure around public education has eroded. And so are things better? I'm not sure that given the entirety of the situation that they are, things are much better.
Right. And you just mentioned your late father-in-law, and your wife Diana is an accomplished pianist, and her parents, her mother Dolores, is a prolific composer, whose work I've been lucky enough to hear performed. And you mentioned your father-in-law, a cellist. They were accomplished musicians in a time where it was rare to see classical people of color in the field of classical music, even rarer than it is today, and it's still pretty rare today. So can you maybe talk a little bit about what you know of their experience of how they got involved in classical music at a time when it was even more rare than it is today?
Well, my father-in-law started the cello late. He started the cello at age 16 or 17.
Oh, wow.
Oh my gosh.
And he found himself in the U.S. Navy band some years later, playing in the Great Lakes Band with it was a great band. He was playing with people like Clark Terry and a number of really great people who went on to become great musicians. But he wasn't. He wasn't. I don't even think he was playing cello. He was playing baritone in that band, and so he was practicing cello all the time, and only through mentorship and encouragement and determination was he able to catch up. He went to music school in Chicago at Roosevelt. He moved from Chicago after he met my mother-in-law. He played in the Hartford Symphony, and was playing in various orchestras. He played in the orchestras around Chicago that played for public events and things, the Grant Park Orchestra and those kinds of things. And he eventually studied with Leonard Rose, and he was encouraged. And eventually, when an opening came up in the Cleveland Orchestra, he was recommended to audition for George Zell, and he did. And the rest is history. There were two African Americans that were admitted into major symphonies at that time, that month. Wow. And he was one of them. Wow. So he's one of the first two, and he was the longest tenured, because he stayed in the Cleveland Orchestra for, I believe, 39 years.
Wow. Oh,
wow. And the other individual left the orchestra after a number of months, actually.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah, that was his story. My mother-in-law had a different experience. She attended first Howard and then Oberlin Conservatory, and I recommend that you talk to her about her history.
Oh, for sure.
But I don't want to misrepresent her. But she had the opportunity to meet and study with Margaret Bonds. Chicago's a rich music scene, so she had people around her who she could look to emulate and be around, and that's an important factor in the entire equation.
Right.
So yeah, she met my father-in-law. They moved to Hartford, and when they came to Cleveland, she ended up, after raising the kids for a while, she ended up teaching at Tri-C, and found herself, she got her master's at Cleveland Institute of Music, she studied with Donald Erb, found herself composing, and it took off from there. She's since had the opportunity to get many of her works performed. Rachel Barton Pine, her recent CD, Blues Dialogues, that's a piece by my mother-in-law. So yeah, she's been at it.
Yeah.
And I'm happy to see that she's getting some recognition for her work, because many don't. And she is, and I'm very happy to see that.
Yeah.
So we talked a little bit or a little bit earlier about jazz and your experience in that world as part of what you do as a musician, and of the experience of many people at the time when you were coming of age as a musician, even those in the African American community who studied classical music. They went on to play jazz, or as you said, black music, which was in many cases what was the most accessible for them to get into, to break into as a field. Today, people have come to recognize jazz as an art music, and it's played by people of all races. You can even study it at a conservatory, which, as you mentioned, you couldn't do back then, and you can get a degree in it, and it even has made its way into the compositional language of many American composers, including African American composers such as William Grant Still, or white composers such as Gershwin or Bernstein. So what is it about jazz that has given it the ability to cross cultural and racial lines as sort of the only vernacular musical tradition in recent times to achieve the status as an art music?
Well, I would argue that it's not the only vernacular music tradition that has made that crossover. And I think I would like to examine the question a little bit. For instance, Argentinian tango music is a vernacular music tradition that's long been accepted. Astor Piazzolla,
Yeah.
Alberto Hirnestera come to mind
Yeah.
immediately.
Yeah.
Uh, Going back further, Bela Bartok made liberal use of Hungarian folk elements, which are vernacular music traditions. Flamenco music is a vernacular music tradition that's long been accepted as art. Um, Danzón is a vernacular music tradition that's found its way into the orchestra stage through the work of Arturo Marquez and others. Indian classical music has long been accepted as art, although there's a definite lack, in my opinion, of representation of that genre in orchestral circles. I think jazz, and before it ragtime, influenced classical music long before it received credit for doing so. So Debussy composed Gollywog's Cakewalk, Ravel's Piano Concerto in G, and pieces by Satie and Stockhausen and Stravinsky and many others were influenced by jazz, while not always being properly acknowledged for as such publicly. So the question in my mind becomes, why is jazz the only African American music tradition to rise to the status or become accepted as art music? And I, again, will say art music. And I would argue that the answer to that question is deeply rooted in American history and culture, and the way that the music industry evolved within that culture. So if you'll indulge me, I'll elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah.
So first, about the music industry, let me distinguish between the sacred and the secular music industries, okay? And for the purpose of this discussion, I'll only address the secular, okay? So the secular music industry is broken down into three major components. There's the arts component, the entertainment component, and the utilitarian music component. And the lines between those things are a little bit blurred, but each of those areas is close-knit, and access to those areas is controlled by gatekeepers. And most often those gatekeepers are not practitioners. So none of the areas are primarily driven by living and breathing artists.
Right.
So the utilitarian music industry grows out of and primarily supports advertising and marketing industries. It's the background music for selling you stuff.
Yeah.
And it always has been. So the calliope was an instrument specifically, dedicated to that genre. Yeah. The entertainment industry in America largely grows out of the inconvenient and embarrassing chapter of minstrelsy. And that's an entirely separate discussion.
Yeah. Yes.
That is, by far, but that's by far where the most African Americans are who are in the secular music industry are employed. And then there's the arts area. The arts area has been dominated by Western European classical music and art since its inception. The institutions of education, funding, and performance were put there in place to support that tradition. So everything outside of that tradition has long been viewed as something other than art.
Right.
And so in the last 25 plus years, jazz has made some modicum of progress in becoming recognized as art, but and also becoming part of the arts structures that provide funding, education, and performance. So access to funding and performance have long been determined by the degree to which the artist conform to the norms of Western classical music and that tradition, and by the depth of someone's network within that. So their pedigree, their recommendations, the sponsors, all that determines access to funding, education, performance. And that industry, the music industry as a whole, and especially the arts sector, is a microcosm of America. So all of the problems of cultural supremacy and exclusionary practices and pigeonholing and devaluation of anything that is different, those are American problems that are shared by every other industry in this country.
Mm-hmm. Wow. I wonder if you could expand slightly upon, and you said this at the very beginning, about jazz music influenced orchestral music long before it got credit for doing so. And that, I feel, has been, Matthew and I actually discussed this while we were writing these questions, about a lot of Black music has influenced other cultures' music, especially white music, and never truly got credit for doing that. And maybe this is a bigger conversation, but I mean, people bring up Elvis a lot in that conversation, and, other artists that borrowed music traditions and didn't necessarily give credit to them. So I wonder if maybe you could expand upon that a little bit, and maybe how that has affected jazz music in the long term.
Well, you use the term Black music, so I'll generalize even further.
Mm-hmm.
If you look, first of all, classical music has always been a world music.
Mm.
A chaconne. What is a chaconne? A chaconne is a dance that was created by Brazilian mulatto slaves that somehow Black ends up using in a mass. There are the saraband. These are dances that Africans who were present in European culture were doing. The term Turkish music was a general term to refer to much of the music that emanated from North Africa. So Mozart wrote Turkish March, and so there's always been an interaction. Flamenco music in Spain, if you listen to Ghanaian music from Morocco, you hear the roots of those elements. The guitar, the violin known as the rebec. These are instruments that existed in Africa and were there from the time that these cultures were interacting, and Moors were interacting with these cultures.
Yeah.
So there's always been a cross-pollination of influences, and I think that's a healthy thing. Musicians are the first people to embrace other cultures, and jazz has been no different in that respect. Jazz has always been at the vanguard of American integration. So jazz was integrated before America was, and appreciated by everyone, because musicians tend to just care about art and beauty and music. So it's not a mistake that George Gershwin would find himself hanging out in clubs in Harlem and soaking up the music. It's not surprising that would be the case. It's not surprising that Leonard Bernstein would appreciate Black and Latino music the way that he did. Although I think we would find it an affront to them if they were given the latitude to explore and to express themselves in other musical idioms. And we would find it an affront to them if the only time that they were called was when they needed some Jewish music. Or it's Jewish Appreciation Month, we're going to have you this month, We think of it as an affront to them. Well, that same logic applies to everyone else as well.
Right.
So if you're a female composer and the only thing that anyone wants to talk to you about is being a female, or if you're a female arts administrator, and the only and you get opportunity after opportunity to talk, and the only thing anyone wants to talk to you about is being a woman as opposed to being an arts administrator, it would
Right.
get tiresome, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
You know, that is the challenge that we face.
Mm.
So I hope I'm still answering your question, but
Yeah. Yeah.
I'll pause.
Absolutely. No, I think this is a great pivot point to the next topic we wanted to talk about, which is the idea of a musical canon that we see in both classical music and jazz music. And the hope that through our conversations and then through actionable steps that we can take as an organization here at the Canton Symphony, and hopefully the orchestral world at large, that we can start to incorporate these voices of composers other than white men alongside, not instead of course, but and do so in a way that's not simply programming a concert of women, a concert of composers of color, but rather fully integrated into an orchestral season as equal and equally important members of the group of composers that we pick for the season. So on the idea of a canon, classical and jazz music both have one. Classical music, it's Mozart and Beethoven. Big band music, it's Duke Ellington, Thad Jones, and Count Basie. And then if you go to hear a jazz combo, a lot of people want to hear standards like Autumn Leaves and All the Things You Are. Why do canons form, and why are performers and audiences alike still so attached to them?
Well, honestly, I think the concept of the musical canon comes into existence because people are comfortable listening to what they already know
Mm.
and things that they're already familiar with. And as such, it's sort of a form of mental laziness. Uh, One has to be engaged in order to process what's unfamiliar.
Yeah.
So it's easier to program and perform and listen to what you already know.
Mm.
So as a presenter or performer, the more that you cater to your audience's desire to hear only what they know, the more you promote that sluggishness, that laziness, that incuriosity. Okay, and the performer has less to work to do if they only play what's familiar with them. So if you are once you know a piece, it's in your repertoire. You have a group of pieces. You can always come back to that piece.
Right.
Learning new music is a completely different animal.
Mm.
Okay, it takes a lot of work and to take a different approach or to learn new material. And so there's a perceived financial incentive to pacify your audience as a presenter with what they already know, what is familiar with them. But that's a short-term proposition in my view, because it only leads to attrition. The audience gets older, the music becomes more and more disconnected from the current culture. You have to somehow find people who are interested in going back and reviewing that culture. And that pool of people becomes smaller and smaller and smaller.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea of really being able to expand, to promote your own culture and to preserve culture while expanding the pool of people who are interested in things and expanding the offerings is a delicate balance. It's one. It's interesting. The piece that I wrote for you, in fact, in 2005,
Mm-hmm.
the last movement was called Legacy and Vision.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the natural tension between what was and what can be.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at any society, the progression of any society or in any institution, that balance has always been addressed. In order to move forward, you have to have a healthy uh, perspective on what can be. And in order to remember and have a societal or an institutional identity, you have to remember who you were and where you come from.
Mm.
And so both of those things are important.
Right.
So we've talked in some other episodes about the museum versus gallery aspect of what an orchestra does, or at least what an orchestra should do. The museum aspect being performing the masterworks and keeping the masterworks alive. Unlike at an art museum where you can just go and see the painting, in order to keep it alive, we have to perform it, of course. But the other aspect is the gallery aspect, the introduction of new works. The gallery aspect scares a lot of people. And as you were talking about, people like to hear what they know. And we've certainly found that in Canton. Tchaikovsky sells tickets, always. And so what can we do as orchestras, as presenting organizations, to convince our existing audience to give newer music and unfamiliar composers a chance?
Well, it begins with the recognition that there's a problem. And let's look at what that means. If you have people that represent a target group that you're trying to build, only by having people being successful from that group will you have people that seek to emulate those people. So if Michael Jordan had been a cellist, you'd have people emulating Michael Jordan. Right. Okay, and it takes a lot of effort to be both, right? But yeah. If you have someone, if someone can look and see an example of someone who is successful that looks like them, then they're more likely to emulate that person. And so you have to go about helping composers become successful. And diversity is something that you have to follow. You have to first recognize that there's a problem. Then you have to recognize that diversity in all of its aspects makes any culture or any organization stronger, not weaker. So people who believe other than that continue to pursue what is actually fruitless, and that is the path of erosion through exclusion. Mm. So diversification means more than having a Black History Month program or a Women's Appreciation program, as you alluded to earlier. Yeah. It means having an organization and a culture and regular programming that reflects a diverse society and the different worldviews that emerge from that society. So I would ask the question, can it be argued that diversity does not make us stronger? My father was a Tuskegee Airman. Can it be argued that our armed forces are weaker than they were when they excluded African Americans? Or are sports worse off as a result of the inclusion of African Americans? Is the corporate world worse off for having included women? Has the presence of Asians hindered the technology industry or the classical music orchestra? Mm-hmm. It would be ridiculous to make any of those arguments. Right. Mm-hmm. And the same goes for the arts, and it applies to the inclusion of every group in America. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I have the benefit of having grown up in a neighborhood that was very diverse.
Right.
I grew up with Korean, Japanese, Indian, you know, every Jewish people, Hungarian people, everything you can imagine, in the same place. Okay. And I know that the product of that diversity is rich, but it has to be intentional. And the neighborhood I lived in was intentionally diverse.
Mm.
It wasn't an accident. It was a structured diversity program that was featured in Life magazine and Look magazine in the 1950s. Mm. It was an experiment in integration, and it has to be intentional, because it just doesn't happen on its own. Like I said, we've had these same discussions 30 years ago. I was involved in the same discussions.
Right.
So that includes the art sector of the music industry. And so that requires a fearless commitment. It's fear that leads to the fallacy and the fallacious logic that accompanies a resistance to the diversity. Mm. And so that and one of the main arguments is that equating intentional diversity. I'll just start that one again.
All right.
Diversification requires a fearless commitment. It's fear that keeps people from diversifying, and often the reaction is to equate diversification with a loss of quality. So we want to maintain our standards, therefore we keep things the way they are. This argument has been proven time and time again to be untrue, and in fact has been a tool for maintaining control at the expense of long-term growth. So what happens? The institution erodes, the base of participation dwindles, and the organization finds itself in trouble. So artists generally don't want to be pigeonholed. Mm. Artists want to be appreciated and supported for their art, and not solely limited to representing their own cultural background. Leonard Bernstein, George Gershwin are examples of that. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. And there are numerous African-American composers. William Grant Still, whereas he wrote, Afro-American Symphony and different things, he didn't want to be viewed simply as a Black composer.
Right.
And that is part of the problem that we have, is that we don't view diversity in the right way. Okay, so you try to make successful composers. And what is a successful composer? It's a person with a network of performers and conductors and ensembles that's willing to perform and champion their music. A successful composer has champions within the critical establishment that support what that composer represents to the discipline and to the culture. A successful composer has sponsorship through commissions and grants and performance opportunities and performance fees that is sufficient to at least sustain their compositional endeavors, mm-hmm. and if not their lifestyle. And a successful composer has institutional leverage through those associations, and some combination of educational, performing arts, and recording and performing rights organizations that helps them make a living doing that. Okay, mm-hmm. and keep regenerating work. And those things come from proximity and access to key decision makers, a pedigree that derives from that access. Mm-hmm. In other words, you've had access, and now, oh yes, you attended so-and-so, or you had your work performed by so-and-so, or so-and-so recommends you. And the recommendations from influential people are an important part of that. Affirmation from like-minded peers. the ability to an opportunity to navigate through a field of equally capable peers. No one would argue that there aren't more people who are capable of doing the job than there are jobs.
Right.
And so, you have to navigate through that, and the determination to just keep going long enough to succeed. The longer it takes, the more determination you have to have in order to get there. Okay. And that's part of the challenge for Black composers is that, we begin from the standpoint of a cultural disconnect. Whether we perceive it or not to be the case, that we're perceived to be different. There's a perception of a difference. And that's why we're having a discussion right now about Black composers.
Right.
Okay. We are thus less likely to receive affirmation. Okay. And often we don't have the proximity to key decision makers. And those key decision makers can help establish a network that leads to all the other things that we're talking about. And so there are less recommendations and it becomes a cycle. There are very few African Americans within the critical establishment. And so what the culture, what the composer represents to the culture isn't always clearly understood and rarely championed. And then even with all the necessary credentials, we're still far less likely to be hired by educational and performing arts and recording and performing rights organizations and performing institutions. So, I have a colleague who has 2 bachelor's degrees, 2 master's degrees, and almost 2 doctorates, and had difficulty getting hired in higher education. That's crazy.
Yeah.
and navigating through a field of equally capable peers, it becomes a more difficult proposition. And becoming successful takes a much longer time. So you're talking to an old geezer like me, and there are plenty of things that have been left on the table by me. So.
I think it's so interesting how I'm sitting here. I'm like, we ask a question that Matthew and I are pretty sure we might know the answer to, and then you say so much more. And I think on a certain level, I understood that this, we understand it's way more complicated than we need to just program more Black composers, and then the audience will grow to appreciate it, and then things will be better. Like, we know that's not it. There's so much more to it. But you taking the time to fully explain all of the intricacies behind all of these issues, at least for me, is super eye-opening, because I mean, talking about the critical establishment and just what it takes to even, get your name out there, and all of the work that has to be done to just get someone to commission a piece, and how can we talk about getting the audiences to accept a more diverse program if we can't even get a more diverse program because of the establishment and the way that it hasn't moved forward yet. And I feel like it's so much deeper than I even thought.
And for our listeners, so much of what Eric just described is the path for any composer.
Right.
You need conductors and performers who will champion your works. You need critics who will champion your works. This is a hard thing for any composer. I mean, I went to graduate school. Just in the 2 years I was in graduate school, there were probably 15 to 20 composers or aspiring composers that I went to school with. And that's every 2 to 4 years, you're going to get a crop that big. And that's in general. And then you look at it as far as minority composers, and it's even more difficult. So just to emphasize that for our listeners.
Wow. Yeah. So thank you for taking the time to say all of that, because that I think, we ask what seems like maybe a simple question, and then you're like, no.
I hope I wasn't too long-winded.
No, and
No.
it gave us such a clear and vivid picture of how the industry works from the perspective of a composer, which, not being a composer myself, I didn't know a lot of it, and I didn't know really the intricacies of it. And it's so fascinating to hear from our perspective.
So thinking about, talking about composers of color in history and how they have existed for a long time. And there are many, many composers of color that have contributed to orchestral works. They just have not been recognized to the same level as what we talked about earlier, canon. It seems like, now knowing all of what you just said, more obvious to me why we don't know about these composers. But I wonder if you could tell our audience a little bit about some of these composers that have existed for a very long time, just haven't been recognized.
Well, people of African descent have been composing music in the Western European classical tradition since the days of Haydn and Mozart.
Right.
There's Joseph Boulogne, the Chevalier de Saint-Georges, who was a contemporary of Haydn and Mozart. He was a classical composer, a virtuoso violinist, a championship fencer, a colonel in the military. He was a true Renaissance man, and he was the conductor of the leading symphony orchestra in Paris during the time of Mozart.
Mm-hmm.
So these people have existed since that time. Other contemporaries during that same time. Jose Mauricio Nunez Garcia. He was a Brazilian classical composer and was a huge exponent of Western European classical music in the Americas. Frank Johnson, here in America, was one of the very few African American composers during the antebellum period. Mm. He was a virtuoso on two instruments, not trumpet, bugle, the key bugle and the violin. He wrote over 200 compositions. Harry T. Burley, or Henry Thacker Burley is his name. Harry T. Burley was how he's more well known. He was the composer who turned Dvorak onto Afro-American music and influenced Dvorak's direction in music to the extent where Dvorak became a champion of that music and felt that an American classical music would evolve from the music of African Americans and Native Americans.
Oh, wow.
There's much more. I mean, Samuel Coleridge Taylor, who's a British musician. He was a composer and conductor, and he was known as the African Mahler. He was helped by Edward Elgar. He composed a considerable amount of instrumental works. There was African Romances from 1897 and African Suite in the next year in 1898, and Toussaint L'Ouverture, and at the beginning of the 20th century in 1901. By the time he had finished, by the time he was passing, he had toured the United States 3 times and had performed at the White House at the invitation of Theodore Roosevelt. R. Nathaniel Dett. Now you're going to start to notice a real Ohio connection here. Mm-hmm. R. Nathaniel Dett was a Canadian-born composer and organist and pianist. He moved to the United States at the age of 11, attended Oberlin Conservatory later, and had a rich oeuvre of American folk songs, Afro-American folk songs, and spirituals as the basis for his piano compositions, and he wrote in the Romantic style. Um, Florentine Price, Florence Price, um, was she was a Chicagoan, a pianist, an organist, and music teacher. Uh, she was the first female, African American female, to have a composition played by a major orchestra. The Chicago Symphony played her piece in 1933, her symphony in E minor. The Margaret Bonds, a younger contemporary of Florence Price, also was a prolific composer and collaborated with Langston Hughes a lot. Was part of the Harlem Renaissance scene. William Grant Still, who we mentioned earlier, was prolific. In fact, William Grant Still was the first American composer. He was known as the Dean of African American composers, but he was the first American composer of any type to have an opera produced by the New York City Opera. And he was until 1950, his Afro-American Symphony was the most widely performed symphony composed by an American, not just an African American.
Wow.
Okay. There are jazz musicians who have written numerous works. Duke Ellington, of course, Quincy Jones, Wayne Shorter, James P. Johnson. There's George Walker, another Oberlin alum, who was the first African American to have received the Pulitzer Prize in music for his work Lilacs in 1996. Julia Perry, an Ohioan, was an American classical composer and teacher who combined European classical and neoclassical music with her African American heritage. So I wish I could just do a separate show on this one. But Hale Smith, someone I knew who was a Clevelander, and he was an American composer. He went to the Cleveland Institute of Music, and he won the first student award, the first student composer award that was ever given by BMI. Coleridge Taylor Perkinson. He was prolific in jazz, dance, pop, film, television, all kinds of things. And by the way, Hale Smith also performed as a jazz pianist with jazz greats like Dizzy Gillespie and Ornette Coleman, and wrote music and arrangements for these people. I'm talking about prolific people. Mary Lou Williams, a giant of a jazz composer and arranger and educator and pianist. She wrote a number of sacred works. She was a mentor and a teacher to people like Thelonious Monk, Charlie Parker, Miles Davis, Tad Dameron, Bud Powell, and Dizzy Gillespie.
Wow.
Okay. They used to go to her apartment in Harlem to take lessons with her, theory and composition lessons. We're talking about giants. Ollie Wilson, who there's another. He was the founder of the Oberlin Tamara, the first ever electronic music program in a conservatory. There's T.J. Anderson, who was a dean at Tufts University and a professor there. He was the one who orchestrated Scott Joplin's Treemonisha, and he himself is a living treasure. He's still alive. Oh, wow. He's down in Atlanta. He recently celebrated his 90th birthday. He's a person whose works needs to be heard because he's got some monstrous music. Wow. There's right here in Cleveland, Leslie Adams, Harrison Leslie Adams. He's a composer he's also a vocalist. He's had works performed by the Prague Radio Symphony, the Iceland Symphony, Buffalo Philharmonic, Cleveland Orchestra, the Ohio Chamber Orchestra, and Metropolitan Opera singers have performed his works. He's here in Cleveland. My wife recently performed a piece of his with Alicia Nelson, the violist, African American violist for the Cleveland Orchestra.
Wow.
Adolphus Hailstork. If you've never heard his music, it's well worth hearing. You know, he's written a ton of music. He's one of our leading composers today. I mean, I could go on. I haven't even gotten to my contemporaries,
Right.
like James Newton, Bill Banfield, Anthony Davis, and Terence Blanchard. Those are people my age who are doing wonderful things in this music. There's too many more, and
Wow.
I just don't have the time to address all that.
So one of the joys for me
Wow.
during the pandemic has been discovering some of these composers. And it was eye-opening for me because, of course, nowhere in my training were these composers really ever put on my radar. And it was during this time when I wasn't just constantly preparing for the next concert and that one's over on a Saturday, have a day of rest on Sunday, and then Monday start preparing for the next one. When I actually had the time to explore music at a more leisurely pace, I discovered William Grant Still. I discovered Samuel Coleridge Taylor. I discovered Adolphus Hailstork, for that matter. And it has just been a wonderful, they have all been wonderful additions to the repertoire that I am aware of. And quite honestly, as a conductor, has given me just even more of an excitement to get back to live performances so that I can start programming this music.
The entire time you were talking, my mouth, I'm wearing a mask so you can't see, but my mouth was wide open because it just reveals the gaps in my education. I went to a conservatory of music, and yet I know some of those names because I've done my own research, but there was many of those names I did not know. And as someone who has gotten an education in music, in orchestral music, in performance, I feel like I should have known a way larger percentage of those composers than I did. And, looking now at higher education, and, we mentioned that you're a professor at Berkeley, and, what could institutions of higher education be doing to, better educate their own students, but also help foster students of color who end up going to universities? I don't know what you've seen at Berkeley. And I know Berkeley's maybe a different example than something like CIM, just a little bit of a different way of doing things. But I feel like there's a gap in my education that should have been filled while I was at university.
Well, Berkeley is different in many respects. But recently, I don't know if you're aware, Berkeley merged with the Boston Conservatory.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
that's what the oldest conservatory in the country. So the breadth of what Berkeley offers has increased dramatically. But under the leadership of Roger Brown and the president, and Provost Larry Simpson, who's a native of Cleveland, by the way, they recognize that African American students at Berkeley face several challenges that are unique in a collegiate environment. And a board member at Berkeley made a very substantial financial commitment to put in place a mentoring program that would carry the student through the transition from high school into college, and then through their first year and beyond. And it's been very successful. It's resulted in higher retention rates of African American students. In fact, I would strongly suggest that for one of your podcasts, you interview Larry Simpson, who's a Clevelander. He's a former president of Arts Presenters and the New England Foundation for the Arts, as well as the provost of Berkeley. I think you would find that it's some interesting answers to your questions there. But I think that to address the question of what steps can be taken by higher education to encourage more people of color, I think at the college level, by the time a student gets at the college level, people are pursuing a realistic path toward a professional career. And I have actually seen people in higher education over the course of my lifetime steer students away from classical music, steer African American students away from classical music on the basis of a very realistic perception that they aren't going to be accepted and they won't make it. And so in the best interest of the student, these people steered these students away from that. Seeing people who look like you, as I alluded to earlier, succeed in a given field is the best motivator.
Right.
So it really comes back to the institutions themselves, like the Canton Symphony, arts institutions and performing institutions in general, institutions within the arts sector becoming more inclusive, because all of those institutions contribute to the success of African American artists. And then it becomes a more realistic career path. And then it becomes something that people can relate to as an audience because they see people who look like them on stage. And so those things are it's all part of a larger equation that becomes critical, and it really comes back to just being inclusive.
Wow.
So orchestras at the professional level often, if not always in this day and age, audition their members behind a screen. And the goal of this, of course, is to ensure that the people who are picked for the position, the various openings, are the best musician and are evaluated only on that criteria. But we recognize that we need more diversity on the stage and that we need to attempt some deliberate efforts to do so. What do you think, keeping in mind that we, of course, work in a union environment and the behind the screen audition is such an established part of what we do, do you have any ideas for some creative solutions to this issue to get more minority presence on the stage?
Well, first of all, I just as a casual observer, I can think of several ways to defeat the behind the screen audition process. Cough when you sit down. There's there are a lot of ways to get around it. But I think that creatively, it really comes down to the will to grow. If an orchestra wants to grow, just as if America wants to flourish, then it will be incumbent upon that institution to become more inclusive, because anything else is attrition. It will amount to basically cutting off your own foot. No one flourishes by having by limiting the pool of participants. So as your pool of participants increases, your audience increases. And that is the case for every single institution in America.
Right.
You cannot limit the potential of half of your people or a third of your people or whatever it is and flourish. It takes too much energy to do that, first of all. Second of all, that also means that you're going to limit your growth by that much, at least. And it's not linear, it's geometric. So I think that the will to grow and survive is what will drive and what has to drive this.
Yeah.
Any exclusionary practice is limiting the entity that does the excluding. It doesn't pay to not have women represented in your organization. I can remember when almost all of the people I saw in the arts were white males. Okay? Almost all the professors, if even today in the music industry, 70 some odd percent of the people who run the music industry are white males. That cannot be the case if the industry is to flourish.
Yeah.
It cannot, and we are in fact in attrition. And so I think that we have to be inclusive in order to survive, in order to grow.
I think at the very, very beginning of our conversation, I think you mentioned public education, and you mentioned how it is deteriorated, especially when it comes to music education. And I think we all understand, and for the people who have been listening to the podcast since the first episode will have heard us talk about the pipeline of having good education, good music education at a young age that is accessible and equitable for all types of students, so that in 20 years, once they've gone through university, they have the capability to audition for orchestras and have, diversity on stages that way. Looking at our education system now, that doesn't exist for all students. So I don't know what your perspective on that is in creating a more equitable education environment.
Well, first of all, there is a larger African American middle class than there ever has been numerically. So there are numerous students. I have, through attendance at the Color of Music Festival, the festival that they have at Eastman School of Music in Rochester, through attending events at the Sphinx organization, through numerous channels like that, I have seen a good amount of musicians who are capable of playing in an orchestra. They're there. And it really comes down to the will to hire them. Every member of the orchestra is not a principal. So the ability to hire someone who can do the job well, not lower your standards a bit, that's already there. And it comes down to the will to do it. And that's where the rubber hits the road to me. I have been encountering African American musicians of high quality for a long time now. And I know that they are there. And I've seen some fantastic musicians have to move on. It's or basically move into the teaching realm as opposed to getting an orchestra job or something else. There are people that are capable of doing these jobs, and I think it's incumbent upon any industry that wants to grow to mine the potential of their pool. So we can't expect that we're going to fix the U.S. education system first before we can address this problem, because the U.S. education system is not in good shape.
Right.
But there is more diversity at high-level schools than there ever has been.
Mm-hmm.
And there is more diversity at private schools, schools with great music programs. There are people taking lessons and attending prep programs all over the country. I have a friend whose daughter is a fantastic young cellist. She's not even considering a career in classical music because that doesn't seem to be a realistic option.
Mm. Mm.
And what I would say is that that's the problem that we need to address. There needs to be evidence that you can succeed. As I said, I lived in a neighborhood where a Cleveland Orchestra member lived 3 doors down from me. It was a nice neighborhood. He was obviously able to make a living. I could see that people could make a living playing music.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he didn't look like me, but he was at least a musician. I could see that people did that. It wasn't something I was able to see for myself and I didn't see anyone else on that pathway. But as I said, others, if they have the opportunity to see someone who looks like them, then they can see a possibility of success for themselves in the field.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's what it comes down to.
Yeah.
So the most crucial piece of this is going to be getting more representation on the stage. And of course, as we mentioned, on the concert programs, on what is played, what pieces are played.
As a regular course of events.
Right.
Of course,
Right.
of course. And I would say that something we can do right now is start diversifying our programming. We can do that right now.
Mm-hmm.
And then the process of getting more musicians from minority musicians onto the stage is going to be probably a bit longer of a process, just given the nature of how orchestras work. There's people have their chairs for a long time. People retire eventually. It's a longer term process. So with that in mind, what are some things that we as professional orchestras can do right now to engage the minority communities that our orchestras would like to serve, and in a meaningful way?
Well, it's interesting. That exact same question was asked during that panel meeting 32 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I made the suggestion that you could alter your programming, and one would have thought that I don't know, pulled out a hand grenade and put it on the table.
Oh gosh.
I mean, it was that, yes, you change your programming. You make some alterations to your programming. You engage musicians of color, and I consider everybody except European Caucasian Americans to be people of color. All right, you engage them as a matter of course. All right, you don't have to wait till Women's Day to have a women's program. If you're doing that, then you won't only have a bunch of people show up on that program. They will start to come throughout the year.
Right.
And then, and if Tchaikovsky, if the Nutcracker is selling you tickets, then on that same program, you can do something else.
Right. Yeah.
And that's fine. And I think that the idea of changing programming, as I've said, it's easy to do what you've always done. That's the easiest thing to do. The more difficult thing, and I know this from my own experience as an administrator, is to be creative every time out the gate. and to think up new approaches and new ideas. And that requires a different level of energy, and it requires work. But the work pays off because of the fact that you now have something that you can look forward to as a benefit.
Right. Yeah. I think this entire conversation, you know, I think Matthew and I, through conversations that we've had doing this podcast, we've come to realize a lot of things that we did not know before. And it has become more obvious to us how very, very complex some of these solutions are going to have to be, and how very simple some of the other solutions are, as simple as simply just programming things, just putting it on the stage and doing it. And even if there might be some backlash, even if some audience members aren't going to like it, in the long run, like you have said multiple times today, it will pay off and it will lead to growth for an organization instead of the, as the deterioration or attrition or all the things that you have said today. And I just really want to thank you for how much you have shared with us today. I know we've been talking for quite a while now, and I very, very much appreciate it. And before we finish out this conversation, I mean, this podcast is called Orchestrating Change because that's exactly what we want to do. So I was wondering if you could just, any final thoughts or any other things you have wanted to say today that we haven't gotten to about how we should be orchestrating change here at the Canton Symphony.
Well, I would say look inward. If you don't have any African Americans working there, that might be a place to start. As far as African Americans are concerned, I'm looking at a female, and I know that the executive director is a female. So I know that you have representation by women. I know that Kelly Corcoran, who was the conductor for the piece when I was last commissioned by the orchestra, she was a female conductor that you had. Do you have any African American conductors? And do you maybe an assistant conductor, a guest conductor? If you need any names, I can make some recommendations to you. That can come in and do something for the orchestra or with the orchestra, just as a matter of course, not waiting till February to do it, but June, or whenever your Susan begins or ends, September the 30th or whatever it is, you can have someone else do something. You can have a person around you that can inform you of possibilities. People who are African composers, African American composers, or Latino composers, or someone composing Indian music, whatever it is. If you have someone around you who can inform you of those things, then you'll be more in the loop and more likely to be able to incorporate those things into your thinking and your programming. So I would say diversify intentionally.
Eric Gould, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, it's been a pleasure talking with you, and I look forward to speaking with you in the future and in the post-COVID era in person.
Yes.
Absolutely. Eric Gould, composer and pianist, professor at Berklee College of Music, and who has appeared as both a composer and guest soloist here at the Canton Symphony Orchestra.
Thank you very much.
The Stark County Minority Business Association is a nonprofit organization comprised of business leaders invested in the economic growth of the Stark County community and beyond. This organization provides services to minority business organizations and serves as a resource for referrals and recommendations. Their goal is to enhance partnerships between minority business members and majority-owned businesses to create greater economic impact in Stark County. The Stark County Minority Business Association provides numerous services to its member organizations to assist them in growing their establishments, creating jobs to enhance economic growth in our region, and procuring loans and contracts to stabilize their organizations. One of their featured programs is the Revolving Loan Fund, which was established to create pools of funds for member organizations to enhance, expand, or create job growth and development. Funds for the program are accumulated through membership dues and philanthropic entities. For more information, visit starkminoritybusiness.org.
Orchestrating Change is a production of the Canton Symphony Orchestra.
Our theme music was composed by Eric Gould and performed by Derek Snyder and Tim Adams.
Our audio engineer is Nathan Maslick.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.